Well, hello. So glad we get the opportunity to continue our study of the prayers of the Old Testament, looking at how the Hebrew Scriptures have so much wisdom for us in the idea of how we can approach prayer with our God. They show us how we can utilize prayer, what the good purposes of prayer are, and how we can take inspiration from our forefathers and how they prayed and how they lived their lives in dedication to the Lord. Today we're going to take a look at a prayer of King Solomon. And this is going to be the prayer that takes place in 1 Kings chapter 3. Now, for context's sake, 1 Kings 1 through 2 is not exactly a good look for King Solomon. I think King Solomon is probably one of the more misunderstood characters in the Bible. I think we really tend to focus on one or two things that happened to him and really ignore the broader picture of the Book of Kings. Book of Kings, the first 11 chapters are all about King Solomon. And like the first beginning of the book and the end of that section really do not have Solomon in a good light. And really, they're kind of portraying Solomon as a key reason why the nation of Israel as a whole has fallen, and certainly a key reason why it ended up divided. And so the end of the book, or the end of this section, we understand Solomon falls prey to vanity. He falls prey to idolatry because of his many wives. Well, those seeds are all sown in the first part of Solomon's reign. And we're already seeing poor decisions being made, partly because of David's influence, partly because of Solomon's poor decision-making. But when we read the first two chapters, we're not convinced Solomon's going to be a good character, because all he does is essentially he takes the throne in questionable circumstances and then kills a whole bunch of people. So when we get to 1 Kings chapter 3, we're a little concerned about Solomon. We're a little concerned about who is this guy going to end up being. And those concerns, at least temporarily, are alleviated by what occurs in 1 Kings chapter 3 and verse 6. And what's going to occur is that in chapter 3, Solomon, we're expressly told in verse 3, if you want to go ahead and start there, it says, "Now Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except he sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. The king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for this was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. In Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream at night, and God said, 'Ask what you wish me to give you.'" Now, this doesn't surprise us if we've read the books of Samuel, because as we talked about last time, David is promised that God is going to be with his son. He's going to be with his descendant who's going to become king. And we're given the promise in 2 Samuel 7 that he's even going to rebuke him when he does wrong. But the loving kindness of the Lord is never going to depart from him. And we're confirmed that Solomon, certainly at this stage of his life, is trying to be a righteous individual, is loving the Lord, is doing what he's supposed to be doing. He's sacrificing to God. And so God shows up in a dream to him and asks him, "What can I do for you?" Now, that's a pretty loaded question. I mean, you think about this, this is God in one of his most benevolent passages basically showing up and being like, okay, what do you want? What would help you right now? I mean, you think as a king, there's a lot of things you could ask for. You could be asking for, make sure I have a long life. Make sure that my enemies are defeated before me. David has been a successful king, but there's still a lot of enemies around. Help me to expand my territory. Help me to be enriched with good trade. Help my people to continue to support me. And there's a lot of things you could ask for as a king that would help confirm your rule. And again, the first two chapters have been about Solomon's difficulty in consolidating his kingship. He's had to execute enemies and fight for his throne. And so he's not in the greatest of positions. And yet, what does Solomon ask for? Well, in 1 Kings 3 and verse 6, it says, "Then Solomon said, 'You have shown great loving kindness to your servant David my father, according as he walked before you in truth and righteousness and uprightness of heart towards you. And you have reserved for him this great loving kindness, that you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day.'" And so Solomon basically kind of reiterates the terms of David's covenant. Clearly, he's familiar with the promises that God has given to David, the idea of loving kindness, the idea of if David will walk in his footsteps, the Lord will be with him. And so Solomon's familiar with what David was promised. Clearly, David has taught Solomon to honor the Lord and what this covenant relationship is. He says, "Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Yet I am but a little child." Definitely some poetic expression there. Solomon's not 12. He's definitely a younger man, probably, maybe 20s, 30s. So he's using this kind of as an exaggeration that compared to his father David, who's been king for a long time, was a great king, he feels inadequate to the task. He says, I do not know how to go out or come in. I don't know how to be king very well. Your servant is in the midst of your people, which you have chosen, a great people who are too many to be numbered or counted. Remember, part of the promise made to David was that Israel was going to prosper as well, so he's familiar with that term as well. So give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, to discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours? Solomon asks for wisdom. He asks for discernment. He asks for understanding of how to judge between evil and good. And that's a really big deal in terms of the king. And we see this really emphasized throughout the book of Samuel and Kings, especially the wisdom literature, that a king is measured in many parts by how he provides justice. Can he protect his people? Can he make sure his people are treated fairly? Does he enact laws that are just and righteous? And so Solomon is asking in many capacities, make me a good king. Make me a wise individual who knows what the best course of action is. And this is maybe even reflecting a little bit upon David, because when David made his mistakes, when David sinned before the Lord, it was because he wasn't demonstrating wisdom. He was demonstrating a hunger for power or lust for Bathsheba. And so when David's not wise, that's when David messes up. And so Solomon seems to have learned a lot from his father David in this instance and understands what he needs to be a good king, and that's wisdom. That's God-directed wisdom. And so he asked for that. And I think this is an enormously beneficial prayer for us to think about, because do we ask for wisdom? A lot of times we ask God for things. We ask God to provide us with a better job. We ask him to protect the health and safety of our community and our family and our church. We ask for success in evangelism. We ask for good fortune in business and personal endeavors. We ask for all these things, but do we ask for wisdom? Do we ask for the discernment to understand what the proper course of action is? I think a lot of times we ask God for what we think is what we need. We ask God like, hey, I've already got this figured out. If you give me X, then I'll be good. Solomon doesn't ask for that. He asks, teach me to know what is good. Teach me to understand what I should even be asking for in the beginning. In some ways, Solomon's response is kind of, God, I don't know what to ask for. I'm young. I don't have the wisdom. Teach me the wisdom to know how I should act. Teach me the wisdom to know what I should ask for. Teach me the wisdom to know how to pursue these things. And that's an enormously beneficial idea. And it's something that we should be echoing. We should be asking God, teach us your wisdom. Now, to a certain capacity, God's given us wisdom. He's given us his word, which is the ultimate source of wisdom. Wisdom begins with the fear and admonition of the Lord. It begins with knowledge of who God is. And the Bible is filled with wisdom that is extremely practical, that does give us a lot of ideas of how to be wise in the present world. But we also need to be praying explicitly for wisdom, that God would show us how to behave properly. And in fact, I know this is prayers of the Old Testament, but it's such a clear link, I can't help but go to it. In James chapter 1, in the Epistle of James, after James has clearly made the comment that, the brethren are suffering from trials, they're suffering from difficult circumstances, he says in verse 5 of chapter 1, but if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts is like the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For that man ought not to expect that he will receive anything from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. And so the New Testament echoes this idea that we should be praying for wisdom. We should be asking God not just do X, Y, and Z for us, but teach us how to do this. Teach us why we should do this. Teach us the proper course of action for us to live. And so now we know famously, what God's response is. God says, I'm going to give you wisdom because you've asked for it. And it's good that you've asked for it. And God commends Solomon for asking for these things. He says, you didn't ask for riches or long life or protection from your enemies, but I'm going to give those to you as well. And again, this is not Solomon didn't game the system. Solomon didn't say, oh, I'll ask for a good thing and then God will give me all these things. God's blessing him out of his generosity. He's confirming the Davidic covenant that God is going to be loving and kind and generous to David's son. But the important part of this prayer is not that Solomon gets all this stuff. It's that God confirms his wisdom. That God says, okay, I will grant you wisdom. I will give you wisdom to do these things. And God will answer our prayers for wisdom as well. If we ask, as James says, in faith, in confidence that God can do these things, in confidence that God has given us wisdom, God will give us the understanding that we seek for in these circumstances. And so we should certainly be praying for wisdom as well. We should be asking not just for God to act on our behalf, but also to teach us how to act like him, how to be more like him in our daily decisions. I hope this is beneficial to you. I hope the idea of praying for wisdom is an edifying concept for you. Hopefully you're already doing it, but if you're not, now's a great time to start. Pray for the Lord's wisdom. Pray that the Lord would show you how to be more like him, how to be more like Christ in your decision-making process. That is the ultimate goal of wisdom, to live a life that is God-centered and God-directed. Thank you so much for tuning in to this opportunity. We hope that you get further opportunities, continue studying with us. We hope it's been beneficial to you in all these capacities, and we can't wait to see you again next time. God bless.